Secrets of the Federal Reserve's money printing revealed. By the end of this video, I can promise you're going to know 10 times more about the Federal Reserve and money printing than Jerome Powell himself. I'm going to explain this to you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the fact that the Fed doesn't really print money. And I know this may come as a shock to a few of you, and to others, you'll say, yeah, George, I get it. The Fed needs the government to spend money. They monetize the debt, or the banks need to lend. I've heard this all before, but don't you worry. During this video, we're not only going to go over things you haven't heard of before, but we're going to go over a lot of things you have never even thought of before. But you need to know this stuff if you want to invest well into the future. Whoa, time out. I want to explain this just a little further to make sure that we are all on the same page, because it's very, very important that you understand the details. When most people think of money or dollars, they're thinking about the dollars that are circulating in the real economy, chasing goods and services. So this is what most economists call M2 or broad money supply. And my whole point here is the Fed doesn't print those dollars that circulate in the real economy chasing goods or services. And they definitely don't control directly how many dollars are circulating in the US domestic economy, and especially not the global economy. What they do create are bank reserves denominated in dollars. A lot of economists call this base money. And these bank reserves are liabilities of the Fed, just like the dollars you have in your account are a liability of your local bank, whether that's Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America. They use these bank reserves to buy assets when they're doing quantitative easing. And we're going to get into the process of quantitative easing much more extensively throughout the rest of this video. We're going to start with definitions. So when most people say the Fed prints money, what they're referring to is the broad money supply, or M2 money. And the best way to think about this is it's really the money on the balance sheets of non-bank entities in the real economy. So the average Joe and Jane corporations, also maybe some hedge funds, some financial institutions, but it's kind of these non-bank entities. And we're going to get into the nuance as to what makes the non-bank entities different in step number 2. But most people believe that the Fed has total control over the amount of money in the system, or said another way, the amount of broad money or M2 money supply, to the point where if this is a chart of base money and broad money, so base money would be the bank reserves denominated in dollars that everyone knows the Fed can print at will. If that goes up, then broad money has to go up in lockstep. And usually there's a multiplier because there's a 10% reserve ratio, or there was prior to the survey sickness March 2020. So if we started $1 trillion in base money, well, that would give us 10 trillion in broad money. And as base money goes up, broad money goes up at the exact same rate. Most people believe the Fed has this type of control over the amount of money, dollars, or liquidity in the system. And they are absolutely 100% wrong. And you don't have to take my word on it. Let's just look at some charts. Here we've got one going back to 1990 all the way to today's date. On the right, or on the left, on your left, we go from 0 up to $5 trillion. This is the amount of bank reserves on the Fed's balance sheet. These are the assets of the commercial banks themselves, or some of the dollar-denominated assets. So prior to the GFC, you'll notice this line is very, very low and very, very straight. But if you zoom in, editor, go ahead and throw up this chart, you'll see that between 1990 and 2008, the amount of bank reserves in the system actually went down, not up. Well, let's compare that to what happened with M2 money supply. Because if the Fed is at the center of the dollar universe, well, if the bank reserves went down because of this multiplier effect, then the amount of M2 money supply should go down. But you will see by looking at the chart with the exact same dates that M2 money supply went from $3 trillion all the way up to $8 trillion. How on earth does this happen if the amount of bank reserves in the system dictate the amount of broad money supply? Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's look at post-GFC. So call it 2014 to 2020. The amount of bank reserves on the Fed's balance sheet went down significantly. You say, yeah, George, well, their balance sheet might have expanded because they're creating dollar bills, green pieces of paper, just putting them in a Brinks truck and sending them off to the banks. Not really. If we look at the Fed's balance sheet in total, we see that it was flatlining during this period, and it also came down. So once again, you would expect M2 money supply to also go down, and we see that it actually went up. And even during this time frame, from the start of QE1 all the way up to QE3, the Fed's balance sheet of the bank reserves go almost straight up. But what happens to this line? It's just straight on the exact same trend going back to 1990. The bottom line is this chart looks absolutely nothing like this chart. And if the Fed is the master of the dollar universe, then it should look like this chart. Editor, let's go ahead and throw up a chart of bank credit going back to 1990. And we can see that this chart looks a lot more similar to M2 money supply than the chart of bank reserves. Now, I'm not saying that the banks are entirely responsible for the amount of M2 money supply during a time when the Fed is doing basically QE infinity, but I'm saying that the bank credit or issuing loans has a lot more to do with money printing, quote unquote, than the Fed's balance sheet. Now, I will admit there are times when quantitative easing can contribute to broad money supply actually increasing. But trust me, it's not what you think. Step number 2, when you're trying to figure out how the government and the Fed impact money printing, the devil is in the details. We're going to go over those details right now. We're going to start with the Treasury, the federal government. Your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam, he needs to spend money, so he's going to issue treasuries. So now we have to decide who is buying the treasuries. Is it going to be the banking entities that most likely have an account with the Fed? Or is it going to be the non-bank entities? And even when we get into the non-bank entities, we have to go into further detail and ask ourselves, is it an average Joe and Jane, maybe a business, a corporation, or is it a financial institution like a pension fund or a hedge fund? We'll get into why in just a moment. So if a bank buys a treasury at auction from, we'll say, Janet Yellen, well, what happens to M2 money supply or broad money, what we're talking about in step number 1? All right, let's think this through. So how is this bank going to pay the treasury for the treasury it just bought? Well, the bank has a reserve account. It's a liability of the Fed. These are the bank reserves denominated in dollars we were talking about in step number 1. But the treasury has their account at the Fed as well. It's called the TGA. So what would happen is the bank would instruct the Fed to wire or just transfer bank reserves from their account down into the TGA to pay for the treasuries they just purchased from Janet Yellen or your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam. So you can see nothing happens to M2 money supply or broad money. Nothing happens on the liability side of the commercial banks. Or, said another way, nothing happens to the amount of dollars that are circulating in the real economy chasing goods and services. Because it's just an accounting entry on the Fed's balance sheet. So again, M2 money supply in this transaction did not change. Well, what happens if it's a non-bank? Well, what they're going to use to pay for those treasuries are dollars that are in their checking account And these dollars are a liability of a commercial bank like Chase, Wells Fargo, or Bank of America. So you could say that those dollars that are being used to purchase treasuries are the dollars that are circulating in the real economy chasing goods and services. So if a non-bank buys from the treasury, then this decreases M2 money supply. And we can see this illustrated by these balance sheets that I use to represent the non-banks in aggregate total. They start off with dollars as an asset on their balance sheet. When they buy the treasury, the dollars disappear, poof, they're gone, and those dollars are replaced by a treasury. Now, I want to be even more precise for those of you watching right now that are trying to figure out how this whole thing would apply to future inflation, more specifically, consumer price inflation. And this is why I broke the non-banks down into two separate entities, the hedge funds and the average Joe and Jane. Because the average Joe and Jane, their dollars are really circulating at much higher velocity, or their bank deposits. They're dollars that are liabilities of commercial banks. Where the hedge funds and the pension funds, their dollars are going to be circulating at much lower velocity. So if you really want to get into the weeds, you've got to separate things, not just by banks and non-banks, but then by average Joes and Janes, or high velocity deposits, and financial institutions that are not banks, but those deposits are very low velocity. So we understand how broad money, or M2, is impacted by the Treasury selling treasuries into the market. Now let's go over what happens when they take the money and spend it into the economy. So just before I move any further, to make sure that we're all on the same page, I was talking about the banks buying treasuries and the reserves going from the reserve account to the TGA. But the exact same thing happens on the Fed's balance sheet if a non-bank entity buys a treasury. What happens, as an example, is the average Joe would instruct his bank to transfer the reserves to the TGA account, and then the bank would go ahead and decrease the average Joe's deposits by the amount of the transaction. So moving back to kind of our step two, within step two, this is when the government is going to go ahead and spend the money that they received by selling treasuries in the first place. So those bank reserves are in the TGA. Now they're going to go back into the reserve accounts from the banks, because they're going to be sending checks out into the real economy, which will become liabilities of the commercial banks. So they need an asset to back up that liability. So the reserves go from the TGA back into the reserve accounts of the banks. Now, for this part, we're going to assume that the Treasury is sending checks to non-bank entities. Because if they sent checks to the banks, again, this equation would be different. We're going to get into that more in just a moment. But assuming that Janet Yellen is sending out stimmy checks to average Joe and Jane non-bank entities, what's going to happen in both cases, whether or not the check was received as a result of a transaction with a bank or a non-bank, M2 money supply is going to increase, represented by this balance sheet. So we started with this balance sheet, and then they purchased the Treasury. It goes over here. And then what happens is now they have a Treasury, but they also have a check from Janet Yellen in the form of a stimmy check that they deposit. So on the asset side, they'd have the treasuries, but they'd also have the additional dollars. This is how M2 increases when the government spends money. So now let's go ahead and back up. We started with M2 money supply not being affected by a purchase of a treasury. But when the money is spent, now M2 increases. So if we have just a simple equation, we start with a net wash, or zero, and then a net addition, which would leave us with a net addition. Pretty basic math there. But if we start with a decrease in M2 money supply when the treasury is purchased, and then we have an increase in M2 money supply when the money is spent, on net balance, now we have zero impact on overall M2 money supply. Another thing that I think will help you understand this even better is imagine that there was a line in the sand between the banking entities and the non-banking entities we talked about over here. So if there's a bank that's, let's say, selling a treasury to the Fed, this transaction happens between the bank and the Federal Reserve, so it's exclusively on the balance sheet of the Fed. Therefore, this transaction, regardless of whether it was the Fed buying treasuries from the bank or the bank buying treasuries from the Fed, would not impact M2 money supply. But if a non-bank entity buys from another non-bank entity, it's the same thing. This would not impact M2 money supply because you're, in this case, decreasing dollars from the account of the hedge fund because they're buying a treasury from the average Joe, and the average Joe's deposit account is actually increasing. So a decrease, increase on net balance, it's a wash. So for those of you who are really paying attention, you've probably noticed that if the Fed does a transaction with a bank, although it doesn't affect broad money, it does affect base money. If the Fed is buying from a bank or buying at all, it's going to increase the size of their balance sheet. If they're selling assets, then it's going to decrease the size of their balance sheet. But let's go back to this line in the sand we were talking about before. What's really important is to understand if a bank buys from a non-bank, regardless of whether it's Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Bank of America, or the Fed, which at the end of the day is just a bank. If they're buying from a non-bank, this is going to impact M2 money supply because what they're going to use to pay for the assets they're buying from the average Joe, the hedge fund, in this case treasuries, is going to be additional bank deposits or liabilities of the commercial banks denominated in dollars, and those are the dollars that circulate in the real economy chasing goods and services. So again, to reiterate, if a bank is buying an asset from a non-bank, this is going to increase M2 money supply. And the reverse is true. If a non-bank is buying from a bank, it's going to decrease M2 money supply. Now let's go over some questions to make sure we're all on the same page and we totally understand how the government and the Fed impact, quote unquote, money printing, or an increase or decrease in the broad money supply, or M2, whichever term you prefer. Really, it's all about the dollars that are circulating in the real economy chasing goods and services. That's why I always say that. Say it till I'm blue in the face. Okay, first question. Does all government spending increase M2 money supply? The answer? No. Only if the buyer of the treasury is a bank and the receiver of the dollars is a non-bank. Remember, it goes back to this outline, this diagram, where the bank is buying the treasury and then the treasury is spending the money to a non-bank. That is going to increase M2 money supply. The next question, does all quantitative easing equal M2 money supply? The answer, no. Only if the seller is a non-bank entity. Takes us over to this diagram. The Fed is a bank. Therefore, if they buy treasuries or assets from a non-bank, that will increase M2 money supply. But if the Fed buys from another bank, there is no impact on broad money supply because the transaction really occurs on the Fed's balance sheet, which is base money, not broad money. I know a lot of you right about now are looking at this and saying, oh my gosh, George, what are you talking about? My head is completely spinning. Do I really need to know this? Why don't I just buy gold or silver, or I'll just invest in my 401k, let my financial planner handle it, or I'll just buy my rental property. I'll just set it and forget it. Do I really need to understand the complexities of how the Fed or the government impact money printing or the amount of dollars that are circulating in the real economy? My rebuttal would be yes, you absolutely need to understand this stuff because we're not living in the 1980s, the 1990s, or even the 2000s when it was much easier to invest. We live in a very complex macro environment. And ignorance is bliss is not going to be an effective investment strategy for 2022 and beyond. Step number 3, we're going to debunk some common arguments that I hear all the time on YouTube videos and social media. Now, be prepared. I know a lot of you have built your portfolio around preconceived notions on how this money printing with the government and the Fed actually works. So for a lot of you, the truth is going to hurt. But I always say that what prevents people from understanding this stuff isn't always their level of education. It's usually their level of cognitive dissonance. Before we go any further, I want to go back to step number 2, another important reason you understand this stuff, not only for your portfolio, not only for understanding inflation, disinflation, deflation, but let's remember, let's go back to 2008, the GFC. The Austrians didn't have a detailed understanding of what we went over in step number 2. And as a result, a lot of them made big errors in what they thought the probability that we would see consumer price inflation, if not hyperinflation, because the Fed was doing quantitative easing 1, 2, and 3. The Austrians, or a lot of them, got it wrong because they didn't analyze the detail. They just looked at things too generally, and they were so general about the way they looked at money printing, it was actually inaccurate. And I'll be the first person to admit that I've done the exact same thing. A lot of my videos, I've said that if the government deficit spends, and that's monetized by the Fed, then that equals money printing or an increase of M2 money supply. And as we went over before, that isn't always true. The devil's in the details. The first common argument I always hear is that quantitative easing increases the bank's balance sheet capacity. Therefore, if the banks have more balance sheet capacity, then the loans are going to increase. If the loans increase, then the money circulating, the dollars circulating, chasing goods and services in the real economy is also going to increase. But what this assumes is that the bank's balance sheets are constrained to begin with, and they aren't. Let me give you an example. Here is a bank that is in, let's say, the domestic United States, and let's go back prior to March of 2020, when they had a 10% reserve requirement. So all these people would say, yeah, with this 10% reserve requirement, the Fed micromanages the amount of lending and therefore the amount of dollars in the real economy because the banks can't lend more than they have reserves to back those loans or those deposits, to be more specific. But now what we need to understand is that all of these banks have relationships or subsidiaries with banks outside of the United States, and these banks do not have reserve requirements. And this is important. Let's check this out. If the bank with a 10% reserve requirement starts with bank reserves as an asset on their balance sheet and deposits. Now we'll say these bank reserves total $10 and the deposits total $100. So with that 10% reserve requirement, they're good to go. Let's say they've got a treasury on there with $90. So got $100 worth of assets, $100 worth of liabilities. I wanted to make these squares the appropriate size based on how many dollars they represented. But we have to understand that although the bank's balance sheets are not constrained, my artistic ability definitely is. So now let's assume this bank wants to create another loan for $100. They see a wonderful opportunity out there to make money. Well, what are they going to do? They can't do the loan and meet this 10% reserve requirement because the new loan is going to create $100 of additional deposits. It's actually quite simple. What they'll do is they'll just take that new deposit and they'll shoot it over to their subsidiary bank, or the bank without the 10% reserve requirement. And then they'll just give them an IOU for the asset. So the deposits are now a liability of this bank, the $100 worth of deposits that was created by this new loan. And the assets that would match up that deposit would be an IOU for $100 from this bank to this bank. So then the balance sheet would end up looking like this. We'd have the original $10 worth of bank reserves and $100 worth of deposits. We'd have that $90 treasury. We'd have the new loan for $100, and we'd have an IOU to subsidiary bank for $100, which would be the liability. So you see what they've done is they've basically swapped the deposits for an IOU or a loan extension of credit, however you want to look at it. And therefore, they reduce the amount of deposits so they can make that loan while at the same time they can meet the 10% reserve requirement. And this is just one simple way. There's about 1,000 different ways for banks to really get around this reserve requirement or to get around any constraint that they might have. Now, this is with the exception of Basel III. That's a completely separate topic, completely separate video. We're just going to assume that they don't have any other perceived or actual constraint on their balance sheet other than this 10% reserve requirement. So another way they could do it is they could simply just go into the repo market. So this balance sheet represents a transaction where instead of going to the subsidiary bank, they just go into repo, they borrow the bank reserves, and they just give the counterparty basically an IOU. So what the balance sheet looks like then is the $10 in initial reserves they had. And on the liability side, the $100 worth of deposits, the new loan for $100, the new deposit for $100. But they went out to the repo market and they borrowed $10 worth of bank reserves, and they now have a $10 IOU to the counterparty. So now they have $10 of bank reserves to meet this $100 deposit, and they have $10 worth of bank reserves to meet the new $100 deposit that was created by the additional loan. So as you can see clearly, if the banks want to make a loan and create more dollars circulating in the real economy, they'll go ahead and do it. Another thing this argument assumes is that the assets held by the bank are somehow illiquid. This has never made a lot of sense to me. So the process of quantitative easing is when the Fed comes in and they buy, let's say, treasuries from the bank, and then the argument is, well, now the bank's going to take those bank reserves that they have instead of that treasury, and they're going to go ahead and create all these additional loans, and that's going to be money printing in the real economy. As if the bank, if they wanted to make the loan in the first place, couldn't have just sold the treasury to get the bank reserves they need. And for those of you really paying attention, you'd say, well, George, they wouldn't even have to sell the treasury because that's what they'd use as collateral in that repo transaction. Why did you use that IOU? And I specifically use this IOU instead of the treasury coming off their balance sheet because although it's supposedly a collateralized loan, usually the treasury doesn't even come off the balance sheet of the borrowing bank. But that's another rabbit hole that we'll have to dive down in another video. The next argument that I see all the time is quantitative easing lowers interest rates. Therefore, if interest rates in the real economy, like mortgages, go down, that means lending goes up and more dollars circulating in the real economy. Editor, let's go ahead and throw up a chart of quantitative easing versus the 10-year treasury yield. And what you can see is there isn't the inverse relationship that you would expect from the Fed creating more bank reserves or quantitative easing and the 10-year treasury. In other words, what most people assume is when the Fed does quantitative easing, rates actually go down. Or what we can see in the past through QE 1, 2, 3, and even during the cerveza sickness is when the Fed increased their quantitative easing, interest rates actually went up, not down. Another problem with this argument is it assumes that if rates go down, interest rates, that lending always goes up. And this isn't necessarily the case. What happens if demand for loans actually goes down? And you say, oh, George, well, that's impossible. Let's look at mortgage rates. If they go from 5% down to 3%, then more people are going to be borrowing money. Maybe, maybe not. It depends on their balance sheet and it depends on their level of income. Let's go back to 2012. I remember I was in the real estate market. I was buying as many properties as I possibly could. And I remember back there, interest rates were very, very low, but it was almost impossible to get a loan. A, very few people wanted loans to buy homes. And B, the banks looked at the risk reward, and to them, it didn't make sense. So just because rates are low doesn't necessarily mean that the amount of lending goes up. If demand doesn't increase, most of the time it does, but not always, or if the risk reward doesn't make sense to the banks to lend in the first place. But even in my rebuttal, there's nuance. If the Fed buys mortgage-backed securities or corporate debt, and this is part of their QE program, let's say, and they're not buying treasuries, yes, this could increase the amount of lending. Why? Because the banks have zero risk whatsoever, because they can just sell the paper to the Fed or the government or whomever is backstopping it. So we have to look at what the Fed is actually buying, not just the interest rate. But broadly speaking, quantitative easing itself doesn't necessarily increase lending, because it doesn't necessarily decrease interest rates. And then it's all dependent upon the demand and what the banks see in the marketplace, in the real economy, as their risk reward to issue the loan in the first place. And another thing that people always push back on in social media is they say, well, George, the Fed has to print money. They have to be at the center of the dollar universe. Because if the banks could print money just at will, and they didn't have anything that constrained them, if the Fed didn't control how much money they could print or how many loans they could create, then the banks could just lend themselves money and they'd all be rich. My response would be, well, the banks can lend each other money and they can do it to get rich. This is exactly what happened prior to the GFC in the Eurodollar market. But just because they can doesn't mean they will. Editor, let's go ahead and cut to the new screen. Let's start with three banks: Bank A, Bank B, and Bank C. Now let's assume Bank A and Bank B are in cahoots and they want to get rich, and so they're just going to lend each other money into existence, and they're going to spend the money they lend each other or lend themselves, or however you want to put it. So let's say we've got the assets and the liabilities. So if they lend each other $1 billion, this is how the balance sheets would look for Bank A and Bank B. Bank A would have a loan as an asset. That would be the money they lent Bank B. And Bank B would have a loan as an asset. That would be the money they lent Bank A. And there would also be a deposit on the asset side, because that's the $1 billion. And there would be a deposit for Bank B. This deposit for Bank B would be a liability of Bank A, and the deposit for Bank A would be a liability of Bank B. So since the loans are to each other, they could just go ahead and cancel those out. So what the balance sheets would look like after they do that is just a deposit for Bank A, which would be their asset, and that deposit would be a liability of Bank B. And then they would also have a deposit, which would be a liability, and this is the asset for Bank B. And remember, these deposits that are assets on their balance sheet, we'll say they're for $1 billion. Now let's assume that Bank A wants to buy a property for $1 billion that the banks just printed out of thin air by this process of them kind of being in cahoots. So that property would now be an asset on their balance sheet, Bank A, but the deposit would be a liability, that original deposit. Because let's think through what happens with this transaction, assuming the seller of the property was with Bank C. Well, to pay for the property, Bank A would have to instruct Bank B to send Bank C the $1 billion. So the deposit, which was a liability of Bank B, would now become a $1 billion liability of Bank C. And this would be an asset of the seller. Editor, maybe throw the average Joe up there. We'll assume he as the seller momentarily. But they would also have to back up this new liability with an asset. So Bank B would transfer over their deposit asset that they got as a result of being in cahoots with Bank A. So unfortunately, Bank B would be left with 0 assets and 0 liabilities. So most of you are thinking to yourself, okay, George, well, why would Bank B do that? Well, it's not that big of a deal because then they could just issue more loans just like this. And then the next time around, Bank B could buy the property instead of Bank A. So that really isn't a constraint. But now let's really think this through so we can understand what just happened. Originally, this deposit that was a liability of Bank A was an asset of Bank B. And Bank B had to transfer that asset to Bank C. But wait a minute here. Bank A or Bank B and Bank A were in cahoots, but Bank A is not in cahoots with Bank C. But then the owner of Bank C says, whoa, time out. Wait a minute here. You're transferring me $1 billion asset that is a liability of Bank A. Well, I don't trust Bank A. I don't know them from Adam. I don't know that they're good for those $1 billion. So no, I don't want to take this liability to begin with. I'm not going to take the transfer. But notice, if the transferring asset would not have been a liability of Bank A, let's just say it was a treasury, so a liability of the government, or a bank reserve, which is a liability of the Fed, they would have taken the transaction no problem. But the banks that are in cahoots can't create bank reserves, nor can they create treasuries. The only thing they can create in this example is their own liability, which requires trust and confidence to be accepted by the other bank. So the main takeaway from this entire video is the Fed and the government can impact broad money supply on the margin. But true money printing, the real money printing that matters to the global economy, is nothing more than commercial bank balance sheet management and perceived counterparty risk. That's it. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here, and I will see you on the next video.